You won't believe what just happened in my neighborhood. Picture this, a quiet community, a beautiful lake sitting right behind my house, and me just trying to enjoy a peaceful swim on a hot day. But out of nowhere, she shows up. Every neighborhood has one, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the one who thinks she runs everything. People call her HOA Karen, and let me tell you, she lives up to the name. I was waist deep in the water, relaxing, when she stormed down the path, waving her phone in the air like she was reporting a crime. She screamed that I was violating HOA rules by swimming in my own lake. Yes, you heard that right, my lake, on my property. I thought she was joking, but within a week, I got an official letter from the Ed inside. A $1,000 fine for swimming. In water, I literally pay taxes and upkeep on. Now, most people would just fight it, maybe hire a lawyer, maybe ignore it and risk collections, but not me. I wasn't about to let Karen get away with this nonsense. I started digging. I pulled up the HOA bylaws, every single line, and buried myself in the fine print. That's when I found it a golden loophole so big it practically had Karen's name stamped on it. You see, the HOA board had the power to adjust fees based on property values and community expenses. And guess who was in charge of approving those adjustments? That's right, the board. And guess who had enough votes to swing a decision? Me. So instead of just arguing the fine, I decided to play the game better than Karen ever could. I gathered my neighbors, the same people Karen had been harassing for years with her constant letters and ridiculous rule enforcing. No grass, too. Long, no trash bins visible, no Christmas lights after January. Everyone had a story, and everyone was fed up. Together, we organized, rallied, and made sure the next board meeting was packed wall-to-wall with angry homeowners. Karen walked in all smug, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture us about community standards. But she didn't know what was waiting for her. I calmly brought up the financial section of the HOA charter and proposed a new budget adjustment. A tiny, almost unnoticeable tweak, except it specifically raised fees for oversized corner lot properties. And guess who just so happened to own the biggest corner lot in the neighborhood? Yep, Karen. By the time the motion passed, her HOA fees had skyrocketed by $5,000 a year. The same woman who fined me $1,000 for dipping into my own lake was now stuck paying 5 times that every single year, all because she couldn't mind her own business. And the best part? I didn't even break a single rule. I just used the own system against her. The look on Karen's face was priceless. For the first time, she wasn't the one holding all the power. She was cornered, completely blindsided. She stammered through the meeting, trying to argue, trying to twist words. But every homeowner in that room had their arms crossed and their eyes locked on her. People started speaking up, neighbors who had been silent for years finally unleashed their frustrations. One guy talked about how she fined him for having his kid's basketball hoop in the driveway. Another neighbor told the story of getting a warning letter because his grass was half an inch too tall. Karen was drowning in complaints and she knew it. But she wasn't about to back down. She pointed at me, accusing me of staging a coup against her. She called me a troublemaker, said I was undermining the integrity of the community. I just sat back, calm as ever, and reminded her that everything we did was by the book. No shortcuts, no loopholes she could shut down, just her own rules turned back on her. That night after the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. People were smiling. Neighbors who never talked to each other were shaking hands, laughing, even congratulating me for standing up to her. For once, Karen wasn't patrolling the sidewalks or snapping photos of someone's trash can left out a little too long. She went straight home, and the lights in her house stayed off the rest of the evening. But the story doesn't end there, because Karen wasn't the type to take a loss quietly. A few days later, I got another letter in the mail. This time it wasn't a fine, it was an official complaint directed at me, accusing me of harassment of an HOA officer. She was desperate, throwing every accusation she could think of onto paper, hoping something would stick. What she didn't realize, though, was that every move she made was just giving me more ammunition. And by then, I had more than just frustrated neighbors on my side. I had allies inside the board itself who were sick of her antics and ready to push her out for good. So, when that complaint letter landed in my mailbox, I didn't panic, I laughed. It was so over the top, filled with dramatic language about me being a disruptive influence and endangering community harmony. She even claimed my swimming in the lake was a reckless act that could inspire others to break rules. I knew right then that Karen was grasping at straws, and the more she pushed, the weaker her position got. I showed the letter to a couple of board members who already weren't her biggest fans. Their eyes rolled so hard I thought they'd fall out of their heads. One of them said, "This is exactly the kind of nonsense that makes everyone hate the HOA." That's when the whispers started conversations about a recall vote, about finally removing Karen from her little throne. Meanwhile, I didn't sit back and wait. I kept documenting everything. Every baseless letter she sent, every neighbor she threatened, every ridiculous rule she tried to enforce. I built a folder so thick it looked like a legal case file, and the best part? Neighbors started handing me their own letters too. We built a mountain of evidence that Karen wasn't just annoying, she was abusing her position. And the more people talked, the more united the neighborhood became. Barbecues started happening in front yards again. Parents let their kids ride bikes without fear of Karen snapping pictures. The air felt lighter, like a storm had finally started to clear, but Karen, she wasn't done scheming. Word got around that she was planning to propose even stricter rules at the next HOA meeting rules. That would give her more power to hand out fines without needing board approval. It was the boldest move she could make, and the biggest mistake of her life. Because what she didn't know was that while she was preparing her little power grab, the rest of us were preparing something much bigger. The night of that HOA meeting felt like the Super Bowl of neighborhood drama. The clubhouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. People were standing in the back, some even spilling out into the hallway, waiting for the fireworks to begin. Karen strutted in with her stack of papers, wearing that smug grin like she had the whole world under control. She set her clipboard down, cleared her throat, and started her speech about new community safety measures. She tried to make it sound noble rules about limiting lake access, stricter parking enforcement, even curfews for outdoor activities. But the second she mentioned giving herself authority to issue fines without board approval, the entire room buzzed with whispers and laughter. She mistook it for support, nodding like she was winning everyone over, but I could see it in the crowd's eyes. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor. When she finally finished, I stood up, calm, collected. I thanked her for her efforts to keep the community safe, which made her smirk widen, but then I slid my stack of evidence onto the table with a thud. Letter after letter, complaint after complaint, proof of harassment, overreach, and abuse of power. I didn't even need to raise my voice. I just laid it all out, piece by piece, until the room was boiling over with frustration. Neighbors were nodding, some even clapping as if I was reading their thoughts aloud, and then it happened. One of the board members who'd been quiet for months stood up and said the words Karen never expected to hear. "I motion to vote for the removal of our current HOA president." The room erupted. Karen's face went pale, her mouth open, but no sound came out. For the first time, she wasn't in charge of the conversation. But here's the twist: before the vote could even happen, Karen tried one last desperate move. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted that this was an illegal ambush. She claimed she still had rights, that the bylaws protected her, that we couldn't just push her out. The room went silent for a moment. Everyone turned to me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I stood there, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to make Karen squirm. Then I calmly picked up the HOA bylaws, the very same rule book she had used against all of us for years, and flipped to the section on board member recalls. The exact words were right there in black and white. Any officer may be removed by a majority vote of the board or by a petition signed by 2/3 of the homeowners. I read it out loud, slowly, clearly, making sure every person in that room heard it. The effect was instant. Heads started nodding, people whispered, "That's it," under their breath, and Karen's face drained of color. She tried to interrupt, waving her hands and claiming I was misinterpreting the rules. But by then it didn't matter, everyone could see she was cornered. That's when I pulled out the second surprise. A stack of signed petitions, collected over the past 2 weeks. Names, addresses, signatures, all neatly organized, all ready. Not only did we have the board leaning toward a vote, but we had already gathered more than enough signatures from homeowners to force her out. The room exploded in applause. People who had never spoken up before were cheering like it was the 4th of July. Corinne's jaw dropped. She stammered, pointing at the papers, demanding they be checked for fraud. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of neighbors who had had enough. The very same people she'd written up for holiday decorations, lawn chairs, or driveway chalk drawings were now united against her. The board had no choice but to proceed. They scheduled the recall vote on the spot. And for the first time in years, Corinne wasn't calling the shots. She was the one being written up, documented, and stripped of authority. But even then, even as the walls were closing in, Corinne wasn't finished. That night, she stormed out of the clubhouse and made a phone call that would drag this neighborhood war into a whole new level. Corinne's heels clicked furiously against the pavement as she stormed out of the clubhouse, clutching her phone like it was her last weapon. I watched her step into the parking lot, pacing under the glow of the streetlight, her voice sharp and frantic as she barked into the phone. At first, I thought she was just ranting to a friend. But then a neighbor whispered, "She's calling the HOA attorney." And sure enough, within 48 hours, we all got an email blast from some law firm, loaded with official-sounding jargon. The message was crystal clear. Corinne had hired legal backup. The letter claimed the recall attempt was procedurally invalid, and warned that any attempt to remove her could result in costly litigation for the entire community. It was a classic scare tactic meant to divide us, make us second-guess ourselves and get people worried about their wallets. Some neighbors panicked right away. I had folks calling me worried about thousands of dollars in legal fees or the HOA getting tied up in court. Corinne's plan was working. For a moment. But what she didn't realize was that I had already thought 2 steps ahead. I had consulted a property attorney weeks earlier when I first started digging into the bylaws. And guess what? Every move we'd made so far was airtight. So instead of backing down, I called for an emergency neighborhood meeting at my place. We packed my backyard with folding chairs and coolers, and under the string lights I laid it. All out, I showed them the attorney's opinion I had secured, the petitions, the bylaws, everything. The fears started melting away, replaced by the same determination I had felt when I first got that ridiculous fine. By the end of the night, the neighbors weren't scared anymore. They were fired up. But Corinne, she wasn't slowing down. Rumors started swirling that she was trying to dig up dirt on me personally, anything she could use to smear my name before the recall vote. She went door to door, spreading lies, telling people I was a dangerous influence who wanted to bankrupt the HOA. What she didn't know was that while she was busy plotting against me, someone in her own circle was feeding me every detail of her plan. The insider leak came from the last person Corinne would have expected, a board member she thought was firmly in her pocket. Turns out, even her so-called allies were tired of her power trips. One evening, I got a quiet knock at my door. When I opened it, there stood Mike, one of the quieter board members, holding a folder like it was contraband. He stepped inside, looked around nervously, and whispered, "You didn't get this from me." Inside that folder were copies of Corinne's emails, pages of them. She had been sending frantic messages to the attorney, drafting smear campaigns about me, and even plotting new fines for other neighbors just to scare them back into submission. She wasn't trying to save the community, she was trying to crush it under her control. And here's where it got interesting. In one email, she mentioned a special assessment she wanted to pass, something that would force every homeowner to pay an extra fee for lake maintenance. The kicker? That money would conveniently be funneled into a private project that benefited her property value directly. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore, it was financial manipulation. That was the smoking gun. The next HOA meeting, I didn't even need to raise my voice. I simply handed copies of those emails to the board and to a few of the loudest neighbors who had suffered under her nonsense. The reaction was volcanic. People gasped, shouted, demanded answers. Karen tried to claim the emails were taken out of context, but the damage was already done. Even her closest defenders looked away, embarrassed to be associated with her. But here's the thing about people like Karen, they don't go down gracefully. As the walls closed in, she doubled down. She stormed out again, threatening lawsuits, threatening to go to the county and shut down the lake entirely. She even said she had powerful friends who wouldn't let this stand. The problem was, the neighborhood wasn't buying her act anymore. We'd seen behind the curtain. We knew her tricks. And this time, we weren't going to flinch. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had one more card up her sleeve. And when the county inspector suddenly showed up at my dock a few days later with a clipboard in hand, I knew exactly who had made that call. The inspector showed up on a Tuesday morning, just as I was sipping my coffee on the back porch. Clipboard in hand, bright orange vest, the whole official getup. He introduced himself politely but wasted no time. We've received a report of unpermitted structures and unauthorized use of this lake. I almost laughed out loud. Unpermitted structures? Unauthorized use? This was my property. The dock, the boathouse, the landscaping, all of it had been here long before I even moved in. Karen must have spent hours combing through county codes, trying to find anything she could twist into a violation. Instead of getting defensive, I walked the inspector through every corner of the property. I had the original permits laminated and filed away, and I handed them over like they were playing cards in a winning hand. He flipped through them, nodded, and scribbled notes. The longer we talked, the more his tone shifted from stern professionalism to something closer to annoyance, not at me, but at whoever had wasted his time. By the end of the visit, he looked at me and said, "Sir, everything here checks out. Whoever filed that complaint clearly doesn't understand how this works." Then he gave a little smirk like he already knew exactly who had sent him. He left with a promise to file the inspection report as no violations found. But I wasn't done. I asked him for a copy of the complaint. Legally, I had a right to see it, and when I finally got it, there it was in black and white. Karen's full name signed at the bottom. She hadn't even tried to hide it behind anonymity. That piece of paper became my new weapon. At the next board meeting, I read it aloud for everyone to hear. Neighbors shook their heads, muttered under their breath, and one even shouted, "Enough is enough!" Karen sat in her chair, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles went white, but she couldn't say a word. The inspector's clean report was stapled right behind the complaint, proof that her accusations were nothing but harassment. It was another nail in her coffin, but somehow I knew she still hadn't hit rock bottom. Because the more desperate she got, the more reckless she became. And sure enough, within a week, Karen escalated things to a level none of us thought she'd dare go. It started with whispers. A neighbor down the street told me they saw Karen taking photos at night, lurking around with her phone, snapping pictures of people's houses, cars, even kids' toys left in yards. At first, I thought it was just more of her usual snooping, but then one evening I caught her red-handed. I was walking back from the lake when I noticed a shadow near my fence line. I flicked on my flashlight, and there she was, Karen, crouched down, phone in hand, trying to snap pictures of my dock from an angle the inspector hadn't even bothered with. The beam of light froze her in place like a deer caught in headlights. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stood up, huffed, and spat out, "You're going to regret this." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just being petty anymore, she was unraveling. Her obsession with control had gone beyond fines and bylaws. She was trespassing, stalking, trying to intimidate me into backing down. But instead of scaring me, she had just handed me the final piece I needed. I called the sheriff's office. Not the HOA, not the board, the actual county sheriff. When the deputy showed up, I gave him the full rundown. The complaint, the inspection report, the endless harassment, and now trespassing on private property. He listened carefully, took notes, and then went over to Karen's house. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the deputy knocked on her door. Word spread like wildfire. Karen was finally facing real consequences. The next day, a notice was taped to her door. An official warning for harassment and trespassing, with the clear statement that any further incidents could result in criminal charges. The queen of the HOA was now on thin ice, not just with us, but with the law. But here's the kicker: rather than calming down, Karen doubled down yet again. She called an emergency special session of the HOA, claiming it was to restore order to the community. Everyone knew it was really her last-ditch effort to claw back control. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting for survival. That special session felt different from the start. Instead of the usual neatly printed agendas and orderly introductions, Karen walked into the clubhouse like a general marching into battle. Her arms were stacked with folders, papers spilling out, and her face carried that tight, forced smile she always wore when she thought she was about to win. She slammed the folders on the table and launched straight into her tirade. "This community," she barked, "is under attack by people who don't respect rules, don't respect authority, and don't respect me as your elected president." Her voice echoed off the walls, but instead of applause or agreement, the room fell into an awkward silence. People shifted in their chairs, some rolled their eyes, others crossed their arms in defiance. Then she made her move. Karen announced a new proposal. She wanted to grant the HOA president emergency authority to issue fines, override board votes, and make immediate decisions in the best interest of the neighborhood. In other words, she was trying to crown herself a dictator, right there on the spot. The audacity was unbelievable. A few newer residents looked confused, unsure if this was even possible. But the longtime neighbors? They had steam practically shooting from their ears. One man stood up and shouted, "This isn't a kingdom. Karen, we're homeowners, not your subjects." The room erupted in claps and cheers. That's when I pulled out my ace. Remember those petitions and the recall motion? I'd been holding on to them, waiting for the perfect moment. I stood, raised my hand, and calmly said, "If Karen wants to talk about authority, then let's talk about the authority we, the homeowners, actually have." Then I laid the petitions across the table, right in front of her. Dozens of signatures stared back at her, each one a vote against her reign. The room exploded again, louder this time. People were on their feet, chanting, "Vote, vote, vote." Karen's face twisted from fake confidence to outright panic. She tried to gavel the room to order, but nobody listened. For the first time in years, the crowd had found its voice, and they weren't about to be silenced. And then, just when it seemed like she might completely lose control, Karen tried one final, desperate stunt. She pulled out her phone, held it high, and shouted, "This entire meeting is illegal. I'm calling the county right now." The second Karen waved her phone in the air and screamed about calling the county, the room erupted in laughter. Not polite chuckles, real, belly-deep laughter that echoed off the clubhouse walls. For years, this woman had terrified people with her letters, her threats, her fines. And now, she looked like a child throwing a tantrum because no one wanted to play her game anymore. Still, she doubled down. She started pacing, loudly announcing that she was documenting evidence of misconduct and threatening that every person who signed the petition would face serious legal consequences. But the more she ranted, the less anyone cared. People pulled out their own phones, recording her meltdown. Some even shouted, "Put it on YouTube." That's when one of the board members finally had enough. He stood up, banged his fist on the table, and said, "This circus ends tonight. We have a valid petition, we have the signatures, and we're voting now." The room erupted in cheers so loud, Karen's voice was completely drowned out. She tried to stop the vote, shouting over the noise, but it was like yelling into a hurricane. Ballots were passed out, signatures checked, and one by one, homeowners came forward to cast their decision. The energy was electric. Neighbors who had been silent for years were smiling, shaking hands, standing proud as they dropped their ballots. Karen, meanwhile, sat in her chair, trembling with rage. Her face was flushed, her fists clenched, her phone still in her hand as if clinging to the last shred of control. But you could see it in her eyes. She knew the end was coming. As the Last ballots were collected, the room grew quiet. The board began counting, and with each yes to remove her, the atmosphere got heavier, more charged. Karen leaned forward, whispering under her breath as if praying for a miracle. But when the final tally was read, there was no miracle. The vote wasn't even close. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. The room exploded into cheers, clapping, even hugs. For the first time, the community felt free. But Karen? She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even argue. She stood up, silent, grabbed her folders, and stormed out of the clubhouse without a word. And as the door slammed behind her, every neighbor in that room knew this battle was over. Or at least that's what we thought. We all thought that night was the end of it, that the storm had finally passed and we could breathe easy again. But with Karen, nothing was ever that simple. The very next morning, flyers started showing up on doorsteps. Bright red letters across the top screamed, "Warning, your property values are at risk." And at the bottom, stamped in bold, was Karen's name. She had launched her own neighborhood awareness campaign. Page after page was filled with wild accusations, claims that without her leadership, the HOA would crumble, crime would rise, and the lake would become a public hazard. She even accused me personally of plotting to turn the lake into a commercial business. It was laughable, but some newer residents who didn't know the history started asking questions. That's exactly what she wanted, to plant doubt, to divide. But she didn't stop with flyers. She took to social media, creating a Facebook group called Save Our Community. At first, it looked like just another HOA discussion page. But within hours, it was flooded with Karen's posts, rants about corruption, manipulated photos of my property, even grainy night shots she had clearly taken while snooping. It would have been pathetic if it wasn't so invasive. I knew I had to act, not just for me, but for the neighborhood. So instead of going toe-to-toe with her online, I did something smarter. I let the neighbors speak. People began sharing their own stories in that group. The fines for lawn chairs, the warnings for kids' toys, the harassment over Christmas decorations. Her page, meant to be her weapon, quickly turned into a wall of evidence against her. And that's when Karen made her biggest mistake yet. In one of her late-night rants, she let slip something she shouldn't have: details about the HOA's private finances that only a board member would know. Numbers, accounts, expenses, information she no longer had any right to access. By posting it publicly, she had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Because suddenly this wasn't just about fines and harassment anymore. Karen had just opened the door to something much bigger: an official investigation. And that, my friends, is the wild story of how one power-hungry HOA, Karen, tried to fine me $1,000 for swimming in my own lake, and ended up losing everything because she couldn't stop pushing her luck. What started as petty harassment turned into the entire neighborhood rising up, exposing her schemes, and finally taking back our peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more crazy real-life drama, and drop a comment below. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare or Karen in your neighborhood? I'd love to hear your experiences. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is knowing how to play their own rules better than they do. Stay tuned, because more unbelievable stories are on the way.